Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. On the phone with me today, I have Bart McDonough in New York. Bart is the founder and chief executive officer at Agio. Agio is a managed IT and cybersecurity firm serving the financial services, healthcare, and payments industries. Bart, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I am so excited to talk with you about cybersecurity. I'm just curious, is cybersecurity an industry that is as glamorous as I picture it to be in my head as someone who comes from technology?
Sure. So, I was glamorous, huh? So I think there are certainly moments of glamour in cybersecurity. It's probably the most parallel is some legal work where, you picture the lawyer in front of the jury, and doing that real glamorous work, but all of the work that leads up to that, all the research and the preparation and the interviews, and it's probably a good parallel. So there are certainly times where you get to go against an adversary, whether in test or in real life. There's the time where you get to maybe explain something to an audience. There are certainly times of glamour where I have a lot of fun, and I know our team does. But there is a lot of writing. There's a lot of research. There's a lot of investigation, what we call kind of threat hunting, and sometimes that can take days and weeks before you actually turn up that kind of moment of glory, if you will. But it's a lot of fun.
Oh, that's interesting. It's interesting that you compare it to being a lawyer, because I know I talk with a lot of lawyers and they went to law school thinking it would be all exciting, and they come out and find that it's a lot of research, a lot of paperwork.
Yeah, there's a lot of paperwork involved for sure.
Yeah. Well, so I'm curious, there's this thing that's been all over the news lately. I guess it's been coming on for a few years, but in May, it went into, I guess, full sort of production mode. And it's in Europe. There has been a law that went into place. It's called the GDPR, and it stands for General Data Protection Regulation. And I'm curious to understand, how does that regulation impact cybersecurity as an industry, and also how will it impact us here in the U.S.?
Yeah, great question. So, as short, it is certainly impacting businesses in the U.S. And so to the second part, it's impacting businesses in the U.S. that have any constituent, any consumer, any employee that is a resident of the EU. Even if they're currently living in the U.S., but they're an EU resident, you have to protect their data. So you kind of become in scope. And then to the first part of the question around how is it impacting the cybersecurity industry, there's kind of two big, I would call it kind of legs of GDPR. One is around overall cybersecurity best practice. They talk about you need to have state-of-the-art best practices. In particular, you need to really be able to respond well. So in the area of cybersecurity, we call this incident response. You need to have that response well-tuned, well-practiced, and if you don't, there are really severe penalties, like up to 4% of your annual revenue. The other aspect of the other leg is kind of general data privacy, and one of the challenges is before you can provide privacy or kind of ownership of individuals, you have to know where all that data is. And I know that might sound very basic, but a lot of organizations struggle with what we call data mapping, just really understanding where all their data is. And that's been a real, I would say, positive outcome of GDPR for US companies. It forced them, because of the regulation, to really start mapping all their data, to understand where all their data is, and then start looking at how do you secure it, how do you protect it, how do you manage it. And so it is, while there are parts of the laws that are vague, and that's kind of some of my negative criticism of it, I think the overall aim of giving individuals, consumers, rights over their data is a step in the right direction. And just recently, we saw California pass a a very similar piece of legislation that goes into effect in 2020 over its citizens. It's a little different, but it's, there's like 90% overlap.
That's interesting. I mean, I have to think, every time I hear about these types of laws, coming from a background in digital marketing myself, it would be a lot of work to maintain multiple versions of a website that were totally different and completely functioned independently from one another, one to sort of meet these regulations and one for areas that don't have the regulations. Just in my head, not really understanding the full scope of the law, I would have to think that they actually positively impact us here in the US, even though they are being implemented in Europe. Is that true or is that not true?
Yeah, no, if you take the stance, when you say positive, I would say if you take the stance of consumer rights, then absolutely. No doubt. If you take the stance that says more regulation is bad for business, then you would say it maybe has a negative impact. I tend to favor the consumer advocacy side. I think giving these rights to individuals, the right to be forgotten, the right to have your data if you request it, things like that. Those are all positive developments, modernization of our laws, and keeping with kind of the overall kind of advancement in the digital era. And so I think those are all positive things. And you're absolutely right. What's happening? Global companies, even multinational companies, are really starting to say, okay, if GDPR is the high bar, everything has to meet it, not just our EU citizens. So it is rising, the kind of standard that everyone is operating under.
Yeah. You mentioned the right to be forgotten a couple of times, and I just want to really quickly ask about that. Is that the ability to sort of control our own brand online and like to, not have our name released, at different times for things? Like what does that kind of encompass?
Yeah, so I would say, as much as I'd love for it to be our own brand, I think it's a little bit more even grounded than that. It's the ability to say to a company, any data you have on me, I want you to delete it. And so that's easier said than done in some instances. And then this is where some of the conflict arises. So you have in the financial services space, there's also legislation that says you must keep client records for 5 years, 7 years, and in some cases indefinitely. And so which law wins? And so we're going to learn a lot about that over the coming months as things start getting taken to trial. And the EU governing body makes some rulings on this. So we're going to figure that out. But it's more, I would say more generically, it's just the ability to, as an individual, you have the right to request that your data be deleted, and they must comply within certain amount of days. I can't remember the exact number of days there.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, so I'm curious in general, I have met over the past few years a number of people who are working in the cybersecurity industry. I remember the very first person I met was an American who was in Dublin at the same time that I was in Dublin. He had started a cybersecurity firm in New York, and I think it was around 2013 when I bumped into him. And I met a couple of other people since then who have also gotten into cybersecurity. It just seems like a really booming industry. I think security has always been important. So why is there an increased interest in it right now?
Well, I mean, I think, there's all kinds of stats showing the increased use of information online, right? The amount of petabytes that are created every day. And so you certainly have more and more information online. But why cybersecurity? I think, there's kind of two areas. One, there's just increased liability if we don't handle our data correctly. So, for example, I know a situation where an individual went to forward an email, and the email had a spreadsheet in it, and it had like around 30,000 records in it. And they meant to send it to, I'm gonna change some names around, but they meant to send it to an individual, let's say by the name of Paul Thomas. But instead of Paul Thomas, as they started typing that, it changed it to PTA at mylocalschooldistrict.org. They sent that file out. Well, that simple mistake, because of the sensitivity of the records contained within that spreadsheet, cost that firm about $9 million.
Wow.
And so you have, on one hand, you have this increased liability from data protection laws, like we just talked about, other data notification laws, and just general consumer protection if there is leakage of that data. So that's one hand. And the other one is the bad actors, the hackers. That whole community is turned into, where 10 years ago, maybe it was mainly cyber vandalism, and it was about proving your street cred as a hacker, and you might deface a website or take over a Twitter account or something. Now it's changed. It's evolved. It's evolved into more organized crime, and organized crime isn't interested in street cred. They're not interested in defacing a website. They're interested in one thing. They're interested in money, and so they are much more aggressively going out and monetizing these capabilities. And so with those two things, just in isolation, we're not even talking about the advanced capabilities of state actors, what they're doing. We're really talking about just these organized crime groups that are going out and really trying to monetize these skills, and they're doing it with increased success. And it's really funding these massive organizations. So I think if at a high level, what's fueling this growth in cybersecurity is just the increased liability from regulation, from privacy, all of that, and separately the increased monetization from the hacker community.
Wow, that is so interesting. I feel like we can all kind of relate. I know a few weeks ago, I got a new credit card in the mail for no reason from, I don't know, whichever company. And I called them and said, sort of like, what's going on? And they said, well, one of the places that you've done business with was breached. And so we have canceled your card and here's the new card. And I couldn't believe it. And it was so systematic for them. It was clearly like an everyday thing now.
Yeah, and our what I'll tell you is our top tier banking, certainly in the United States, is really getting very good. I mean, they're catching stuff. They're using deep analytics, behavior analytics, spending analytics, entity analytics to really start understanding threats. They're getting really good. It's kind of everyone else that's really still struggling. But those are really great. I can tell you a quick story about a couple that was going to buy their first home or second home. I can't remember, but they had their life savings tied up in buying this home. And the night before the closing, they get an email from the real estate agent that says all the details. We'll see you at the closing tomorrow, and here's your wire instructions. Wire the several $100,000 to account 1234. We know you're so excited about this house. We know Johnny's going to love the backyard. See you tomorrow, right? And about 2 hours later, they get another email, same email address, that says, "Oh, sorry, I made a mistake. Actually, wire the money into this escrow account, but instead of account 1234, it was 5678. And oh, by the way, we know Johnny's going to love the backyard, right? Kind of thing." And they show up the next morning to the closing, and everyone's standing around saying, "Where's the money?" And what had happened was a bad actor had been watching that real estate agent, living inside their account, waited for that moment, and right when they did, they used all of the social engineering techniques of familiarity, right? They mentioned Johnny in the backyard and great to see you again. And there was no obvious indicator. I think we all think I can protect myself from spam and phishing and all these things because the spelling's terrible and it's some far-fetched scheme. The reality is they're getting just much more sophisticated. And in this case, this couple lost their life savings simply because the real estate agent had been hacked, and the bad actor then was able to redirect their funds. And unfortunately, there's lots of stories like that. That one's particularly tragic. but I like to tell it because I really, if there's one thing I can accomplish is I really would like to prevent that from ever happening again.
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, that's such a big deal. Well, so Bart, help me to understand, like, what got you interested in cybersecurity? Why did you start your own firm?
Yeah, so a few different things. I think there's the just natural interest in data and data security, and then there's the entrepreneur in me. So prior to founding Agio, I worked at a very large hedge fund that had a lot of internal and external data security issues. What I mean internally is we wanted to make sure internally certain people saw data and others didn't. So we were very structured around that, and it was just very interesting the way we did that. It was interesting to me. And then outside, hedge funds, which we do a lot of at Agio, sit in the middle of, on one hand, you have a lot of wealthy investors, whether they're private individuals or sovereign wealth funds or pension funds, whatever. So you have a lot of high net worth investors that connect in with this organization. And then on the other side, you have really large banks, the prime brokers, the Goldman Sachs, the Bank of America, the JP Morgans, Credit Suisses of the world. And so often, though, you have these smaller organizations. I worked at one that had over 1,000 people, but oftentimes these are 20 to 50 to 70 people, and they have very small budgets. And so working with those organizations, I understand the need for very effective cybersecurity, but it can't be powered by 1,000-person army. And so I've always been kind of intrigued in working on systems that need to be very effective, but also very efficient. And the other thing about cybersecurity, which is really intriguing to me, is that every solution's different. So I could get very bored easily if I was applying the same cookie cutter design and implementation to every scenario. That wouldn't keep my attention. But with cybersecurity, it's very unique, and I often give analogies to protecting a home. That depending on your neighborhood and the overall kind of landscape around you, the solutions are a little different. So if you live on top of the hill, you're probably not going to install some elaborate sump pump system around your house to prevent flooding. Likewise, if you have a thatched roof, you're probably going to have to double down and do more things around protecting against a fire. And so depending on the assets and the way people work and their structure and locations, you kind of design a different solution for everyone. There are some basics, right? Like a home, you need to have locks on your doors and alarm system and smoke detectors, things like that. But after that, it gets more. It's more art than science, and that's always intrigued me.
Oh, that's so interesting. And it's also interesting that you service the financial services industry. It kind of ties back to where you came from as well.
Yeah.
So that's
For
so
sure.
great. Well, I've gotten a sense like perhaps there might be a shortage of workers in this industry, but I think you would know better. So tell me, is there a shortage of workers in the cybersecurity industry?
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, I saw some stats recently where it is actually some national security people say it's actually a massive threat to the country that we have such a shortage of cybersecurity, knowledgeable employees, workers, and we certainly know that. It's difficult to find good people that have experience in cybersecurity.
That is interesting. I talk to people about this a lot because I'm really intrigued by this industry, and I'm trying to convince people they should transition into cybersecurity. And they usually look at me like I'm speaking in a foreign language. So from your perspective, like what sorts of people would be ideal to transition into cybersecurity who don't currently work in that area?
Yeah, I think I mentioned lawyers. I mean, so if I back up just a second, let me just describe some of the activities. I mean, some people in cybersecurity write policy. And so this is where people with a law background or any kind of compliance background can be very effective in that. You also have people that do assessments, and assessments can be technical, but they can also be around people, process, situations. So anyone with kind of an audit background can be really effective. You also have hunting going on where you're looking through lots of data and trying to find anomalies. So you think about a financial auditor, right? That's exactly what they do. You're just looking at a little different data set. You have people who do education. One of the biggest problems in cybersecurity is end users aren't aware of risks in cybersecurity, and so we do a lot of end user awareness seminars. So people who have a teaching background or a talent to be able to convey these ideas to others. So that's an area. So there's a lot of different areas where they're not at all as technical. I think some of us who grew up in the 80s might have the war games in our mind, thinking about that movie and everything going on there. And yes, that is some of it, but there's also other areas that kind of complement that. So we've had people successfully transition into cybersecurity from a number of areas. Some of those I've listed. Others more traditionally have been pure technology roles, people who might have been network administrators or database administrators who are on the more technical side. They might have somewhat of an easier path, but it's not the only path. Like I said, we've had lawyers, CPAs, auditors that have transitioned in.
Oh, that's so interesting. That was going to be my question. So I have a brother who is a CPA in the oil and gas industry, and he does audits to look for sort of anomalies in spending and things. And I have said to him before, I think you should consider cybersecurity.
For sure. For sure. I mean, it's that ability to say, here's one of the most frequent activities we do is a gap analysis, and there's a standard. The most common standard is the NIST framework, the federal government's kind of guidelines around cybersecurity, and we'll do a gap analysis to an organization. And there's usually very little technology involved there. You're simply taking a standard, comparing an organization, and writing a report. And I would be remiss if I don't say that. People who really can convey ideas in writing effectively can be very successful as one of these analysts consultants that does this kind of gap analysis. Auditors, CPAs, they have that skill. Now you just need to learn a few different maybe some terminology, some technology, but yeah, you're spot on. Someone with that kind of background would do great in cybersecurity.
Yeah, I think they would find it really exciting. I mean, not that it's, again, like, it's not like a movie, I understand based on what you've shared. But, if they are sort of like bored doing the same old audit within one industry for a long time, especially if they're young and very comfortable with technology, I mean, this seems like a really interesting option to me.
Yeah, I'll tell you the bit it's also more gratifying, and I've heard this from others that have transitioned, is when you do a financial audit and you report findings, you're not moving the needle a lot, right? So unless there's some like really criminal behavior, I guess. But in cybersecurity, we do these gap analysis. We find a series of gaps, our findings, and we report back to them. And generally, we get a lot of thanks, and we actually make that organization safer. And for a lot of our consultants, I know for me individually, that's really satisfying. That's fulfilling to know that you're making a difference on an organization, and not to belittle the financial audit, and I've heard this from them, is they just don't have that same sense of satisfaction.
Mm-hmm. I could absolutely see that. So if we're listening today and say we are a CPA or a lawyer and we think like, this does sound kind of interesting, like where should we begin in terms of a transition? Like, are there certain courses online, or, should we just jump straight to the job that we want to apply to? Like, what could we do that might help to make us a more attractive candidate?
Yeah. So I think, I mean, there are certainly, universities and trade schools that have degrees in this area, and those I don't, those are great. But if you want to maybe fast track it, there's more like certification based training. The SANS Institute is a wonderful resource that we point people to. They have various certifications. There's also a certification called the CISSP. It's a really good one. The CISA, the CISM, those are all very good and not all terribly technical. The SANS Institute has lots of classes. They go very technical, and there's others that are a little bit more on the assessor side. But those are some, I would start there. But the other option, and I'd be remiss not to mention this, is talk to a cybersecurity company. Sometimes they're so in need of cybersecurity people, they will put you through that training. They will put you through the required training that they need you to have to get up to speed quickly. So, it doesn't hurt to explore some of these training options on your own, but certainly talk to a potential employer.
That's interesting. Does it help? I'm actually thinking of someone in particular that I know in the DC area who's looking for something related to security, but it may or may not end up being cybersecurity. This individual has a how do you say it, like a security clearance for the government.
Mm-hmm.
Does that kind of thing help in this type of job, or is that sort of unnecessary?
Well, so for private industry, it can. So if the company is working and doing government contracts, that is certainly a valuable thing to have for sure. If they're working against financial services or healthcare or retail, it doesn't help so much.
Okay, that makes sense. And I'm curious, are there certain places in the US where these jobs are kind of clustered together? Are there certain cities where we're more likely to find cybersecurity jobs?
I wouldn't say there's anything outside of what you'd expect, kind of following general population centers and business centers. So it's pretty spread out, right? So all of our businesses now are pretty data information centric, regardless of what industry, and thus you need a lot of cybersecurity professionals protecting those businesses. So I would say, nothing out of the ordinary.
Okay, that's good. And are they typically jobs that can be done remotely, or are they typically jobs that are done in person at the site of maybe the client, for example?
So, I would say, a little bit of A, B, and C. So I would say, a little bit, some can be done remotely if you're writing policy development. There's no kind of location dependency there. I would say those that are doing threat hunting and what we call SOC analysts, security operations center, those are the people working in the rooms with lots of TVs and blinky lights and all of that, right? Those people tend to be centralized on location. And then some of the consultants, the stuff I've talked about where you're doing more testing, assessment work, those tend to be on client site for a portion of the engagement. And then they can be kind of anywhere for the second half of the engagement, which is usually the report writing phase. So we use something called the Riot Method, which sounds fun. And it stands for review, interview, observe, test. So in order to do some of the interview and observing, you have to be on site. Some of the review can be done and testing can be done remotely, but oftentimes it's done on the client site. Okay. I will just say a lot of on the consultant side, those assessors, they spend a lot of time on the road or working from home, where our SOC analysts are really inside our facilities.
Oh, that's super interesting. Well, so I'm curious if, you mentioned talking to a cybersecurity firm, seeing if maybe they are open to training or kind of what they're looking for. Say that we're kind of at that place and we've started looking for different cybersecurity firms and we're looking up the ones that maybe we should contact in our area. I'll be honest, when I hear about firms, like for example, I have a friend who recently moved to be the chief marketing officer of a cybersecurity firm. And I kind of wondered at the time, it's worked out great for him. But at the time I thought, is that a legit company? I've never heard of that company.
Right.
Is there a way to check? Is there like a list somewhere of like the top cybersecurity firms? Like, how do we know which ones are legit?
There really isn't a list I go to as much as, I probably this answer is no different for any industry on how you determine if the business is legit. Like if they're in early stages, I like to look at who the investors are, what kind of experience the leadership team has, what's their pedigree. And then as you join a firm that might be a little bit more later stage, as you want to look at their clients, their client retention, their employee retention. Again, some of these standards I'm sure that you look at across every industry. You probably need to do a little bit more inspections in the cyber landscape because there is a little bit of this gold rush mentality right now. So you are getting people popping up, starting companies that don't have a background in this, that might not be very well funded, and it's a little smoke and mirrors. So just go back to the fundamentals of who the team are, how are they funded, what are their growth rates. You should ask all of those questions during an interview, and if they're not willing to be very transparent about those, that's probably a pretty big red flag.
Absolutely. Well, I understand that you at Agio are doing some hiring, and I'm curious to kind of get the scoop for those of us who are, interested. What types of roles are you hiring for?
Yes, all of them. We're about a 220 to 230 person shop right now. We're actually 221 with 9 people that have yet to start. So I know those exact numbers, and we have 19 open positions. We are looking for the security operation analysts. We are looking for consultants. For us, consultants are the people that do a lot of the assessment work, as I mentioned earlier, the gap assessments, as well as penetration testers. Pen testers, as they're commonly known, tend to be much more technical, have a little experience. They tend to be a little bit more senior. We're also looking for people that can do social engineering. And I didn't mention this earlier, but this idea. So social engineering is one of the most common techniques to get inside of a network. A common form of social engineering is sending a phishing email, but there's also a lot of social engineering done over the phone or in person. And this, you don't need much of a technical background. You need to be very good at being able to manipulate people and getting something from them. And there's a lot of training on this. And this is where people have a lot of fun. We've pretended to be a doctor in a hospital. Now this is all, above board. We've done this and cleared it with the people that have hired us, but we've pretended to be a copy repairman and brought a box of donuts and to try to use likability to get us in the door, which worked. We've done lots of these kind of social engineering activities, and so these people tend to not have a lot of training. We can train them up on techniques. They tend to start very junior, and then that's kind of how they can learn about the industry and then rise up. Obviously, it takes a certain personality type, but if that's at all appealing to you, you should certainly look at Agio and any other cybersecurity company.
Oh, I love that. I think, the social engineering is such an interesting topic. And I don't know if you're a podcast listener, but I listen to so many podcasts. One of them is one called Reply All.
Oh, yeah.
And
yep.
the guys on Reply All have done a couple of pieces about social engineering and how your stuff can get hacked through that kind of experience. So that's so interesting. Well, so I'm interested, as people are checking out your postings, like what types of folks, like what do you look for in a candidate? What would make someone successful?
I'm going to be broad here, but the ability to communicate is so critical to everything we do at Agio. We ask people to take writing tests. They're not as foreboding as that sounds. We simply just want to make sure you can communicate an idea in writing. Certainly our cybersecurity analysts need to do a good job of that. And so that is fundamental. I will tell you, we do a lot of training, reinforcement around writing. So you don't have to be a perfect writer. You do need to be good at that skill. And then I think curiosity around it and having a little bit of passion around this topic. I have some other friends and that run businesses, and they talk to me about the millennial problem in the workforce. And I've just never had an issue with anyone not being kind of motivated, not wanting to show up, feeling like they have to have other things done for them, this entitlement attitude. And one of the reasons why is I think the people that are really successful at cybersecurity at Agio would do the job even if they weren't getting paid for it. And let me kind of explain that. Would they go to a client side and write up a report? No, but they're still reading magazines. They're listening to blogs around cybersecurity. They're tinkering at home, right? They're quote unquote playing with technology and security solutions. They truly love it. And so then they go to work and they continue to do that. And they have a lot of passion around it. So we look for people that do want to tinker, that do pick up a magazine or a blog or read a blog or listen to a podcast around this subject. We want people to have that kind of innate curiosity and passion around this topic.
I love that. I think that's such a perfect way to look for candidates.
When we do it, when we find that right person, you can train them on process and technology, send them to a certification class, but you can't make someone be interested in a topic they're not.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so I'm really excited to just talk briefly. I know you have a book coming out, and congratulations on your upcoming book.
Thank you.
I'd love to learn just a little bit about it, and when can we look for it? Where can we look for it?
Sure. So Wiley is publishing a book that I've written. I'll tell you a little backstory. I do a lot of these security awareness seminars where I educate more of the kind of individual on the threats facing them, and then hopefully leave them with some basics around what they can do to improve their cybersecurity posture. And so I've done hundreds of these, over 500 at this point, and I got a lot of the same questions. And in a 45 to 50-minute seminar, there's only so much depth you can go into to give them answers. And I was always a little frustrated. So after each of these seminars, I started just adding some notes, adding some questions, and filling it out. And my original intent was this was going to be a kind of handout that I could give out to these seminars. It would be a couple pages. Well, a couple pages turned into a couple hundred pages. And I had this very long manuscript and pitched it to a couple of book publishers. And Wiley has been a great partner. The book's going to come out in middle of February 2019. And you'll be able to find it wherever you buy any books, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all those good places. It's going to be out in paperback and in digital. And then we're looking to confirm the date for the audiobook, which will be coming out right around the same time or perhaps shortly after.
Oh, that's exciting. I can't wait to get a copy of the book. Well, if we are listening today and we want to learn more about you and your work, and also where we can find jobs and apply to work at Agio, where should we go?
So social media, Twitter is probably my most kind of accessible social media platform. And that's just Bart McD, BART MCD. And then lots of information on the Agio website, agio.com. There's a section on me that has some of my blog posts, as well as some video interviews and presentations that we've done. And then also on the agio.com website, there's always an up-to-date listing of all of the jobs and all of the locations where we have employees in, I want to say, about 40 different states at this point, as well as several other countries. So don't let your geography limit you. Please go and take a look. And if it sounds interesting, contact us.
Excellent. Well, I will put links to all this in the show notes. Bart, thank you so much for joining me. This has been so informative, and this has just been excellent.
Thanks, Aunt. Thank you so much.
And thanks everyone for listening. If you've enjoyed the episode today, please don't forget to help me out. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts. The more subscribers that I have, the easier it is for other job seekers to find the show.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.